This is Jeff Kraft or Kalidas, and I'm making a short video for you. This is going to be the first in a series of videos where each video is I'm going to be talking about a common myth that's associated with Tantra. And so this is the first video. And the first myth that I want to talk about is the idea that Tantra is about sex or about sacred sexuality. So if we go back and we look at the teachings of Tantra, if you look back to the sacred texts that are associated with them, you will notice something surprising. I know I was surprised when I first began to really dive deep into those texts. And the thing that's surprising is that sex is almost never mentioned. Much probably like yourself, I first learned about Tantra as being a sexual practice as well, focused on creating more pleasure and better orgasms and more stamina for men and more pleasure, connection, intimacy, those types of things. And that was the way that it was introduced to me. And so when I really started to go study it in a deeper way, I discovered that it was actually hard to find comments or mentions about sexuality in the original texts that are associated with Tantra. As part of the myth that comes along with this idea that sacred sexuality, sometimes some practitioners that also teach the idea that Tantra is sacred sexuality will insist that the Kama Sutra is a Tantric book. And that really is also a myth that's connected to this. The Kama Sutra goes and talks about lots of other things in addition to sex, but it ultimately is kind of like an ancient version of the joy of sex. It shows positions and it shows other types of things. There's some talk about there being I think 64 different sacred arts that are associated with Tantra. And again, those tend to come more from Kama Sutra and other types of cultural references as opposed to truly being something that is specifically to Tantra. It doesn't mean that we can't take those things into our Tantric practice. We can make the Kama Sutra relevant. We can make the 64 sacred arts relevant to Tantric practice, but they're not necessarily what they have been presented to be. And so we're wanting to understand that these are just little pieces of things. And because there is actually, when you dive deep enough, there are a few places in these original texts that do talk about and reference sexuality and rituals involving sexuality. But when you really understand the intention and the implication behind why they're doing these sexual rituals, you want to understand that there's a completely different context to what it is that is oftentimes associated with it in our current time, which is that these rituals are actually used as ways to expand ourselves into a deeper connection with divinity or with God. That was ultimately the higher intention of them. And in a lot of ways, people would prepare for these rituals over periods of time so that they were actually not really so focused on the personal pleasure as much as using the capacity for pleasure that could be awakened in a sexual activity as a gateway into the bliss of divine consciousness. That was really the invitation that it was used for. And so it was used with that intention of connecting more deeply to divinity, but not necessarily with the intention of having better orgasms, of having more sex, having more interaction, blah, 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 blah. In fact, there were a lot of rules that were laid down about who was really eligible to even interface with these particular activities. And they're probably more restrictive than some of the modern tantric ideas that are associated with sacred sexuality might lead you to believe. There were restrictions on who could interact with who. It was preferred that someone actually interact with their spouse and not with a stranger, although of course there were some other things that happened in that as well. It's not 100% black and white, but that's the general idea of it. So when we're looking at Tantra, we want to understand that the original intention in those sacred sexual practices that are truly documented was as a gateway to divinity. And that taking that little slice of this one practice, when there are literally thousands of other tantric practices that have nothing to do with sexuality at all, and deciding that this one slice, this one practice, is really the truth of what Tantra is in the similar way making a mistake of imagining, for instance, that in Christianity, that the purpose of Christianity is to drink wine, that that's how you practice, is to drink wine. And of course, I'm referencing the idea of communion in Christianity. Now, even whether you're Christian or not, you probably know and understand that there's a symbolism that's involved in the sipping of the wine. You know, we're not chugging wine at communion, we're taking sips, and there's an intention of connecting more deeply with what's described as being the blood of Christ. You know, to be inviting that intention of a deeper thing, because the wine has been blessed, we're bringing that blessed energy in with the intention of connecting to Christ through the communion process. So if someone came running up to you and telling you that to be a practicing Christian, all you have to do is drink wine, you would of course think they are crazy, and understandably so. And so there's a similar kind of thing is happening actually in the tantric practices, where this one practice has been taken out of context and has been told to us as being the main practice, that in the Tantra you practice the sexual thing, that like that's the focus. And it's skipping over the original intention. There's a sacred intention behind the idea of communion, and there's also originally a sacred intention behind the use of sexual energy when it was used as part of a practice, but it's not the totality of practice. So that's the end of myth number one. Feel free to make some comments below and click on the links to my site and check out other things that I have going on, and look for myth number two coming up soon. Namaste.